Start with. I'm going to go ahead and give a quick introduction. I'm Melanie Phillips. I'm the head of the analyst team here and run our monthly webinars. Our CEO, Mike Greenfield, is out for the day, but is always a contributor on these projects. And you'll be hearing from our two incredible researchers, Andrea and Ben, who are both leading different parts of our practice areas and across both Embold and Change Research. So, a little bit about Embold Research. Embold Research is a nonpartisan business unit of Change Research that was launched in 2021. We have a fresh take on public opinion measurement and help leaders better understand what Americans want and need. Like Change Research, we still use our dynamic sampling approach, and all of our surveys are completed online, and we do not rely on panels. If you were part of our last month's webinar on the media, you can tell that online is where people are, and it's where we can reach them. And also, we utilize and support with text to web. Next slide. One of the beautiful things about being a public opinion company like we have an incredible amount of data that we use to amplify our insights and share that data broadly. Currently, we have an incredible amount of data that we use for modeling and also to inform these questions. And these Compass polls, these monthly polls that we're presenting, help inform that data. Next slide. If you're interested in having access to this type of data, we update our portal, which is our data portal, monthly, and all of our surveys that we're collecting go into the data portal that allow you to utilize AI-powered data questions and data inferences to analyze millions of responses in seconds. You can subscribe to the Compass portal and get access to this data. If you're interested, you can email subscriptions@changeresearch.com. So with that, I'll stop doing the spiel and I'll hand it over to our first presenter, Andrea.
Thanks so much, Melanie. As Melanie mentioned, my name's Andrea Everett. I lead the research team on the Embold side of our business. I'm really excited to be here today to talk to you all about natural disasters, disaster response, and people's expectations and experiences about it. So the data that I'm going to be sharing today, that I'll kick us off with, is from a survey that we fielded earlier this month. And it looked into Americans' expectations of their government when it comes to responding to natural disasters and extreme weather. And it also looked at what their personal experiences with those events have looked like over the past year. So this survey was in the field from July 1st through July 7th. I just want to give a note that this was during the flash floods in Texas. But the vast majority of the sample here was collected before that news became out. We did look to see whether there were any differences between the responses that were collected before the flooding news became widespread and afterwards. And for the most part, we didn't see that. We're talking about a survey here of 1,736 registered voters across the country. For most of what we're going to be discussing here, the margin of error to keep in mind overall for this survey is 2.9%, but it is important to keep in mind also that when we start talking about subgroups, which we'll be doing, that number will be larger. Okay, so diving right into some of our results, one of the key themes that we explored in this survey was what roles Americans want the government to play in helping communities recover after disasters and extreme weather events. And part of that is about how they see these responsibilities how they see the responsibilities of different levels of government, including federal, state, and local. So we asked this question here, when a natural disaster such as a hurricane, wildfire, or tornado strikes, different levels of government can help with recovery. How much responsibility should the following have for helping communities recover and rebuild? And what we see is that most voters think all levels of government should have a great deal of responsibility for helping with disaster recovery. But at the same time, there's a clear difference between the federal government and state and local governments. So a relatively small majority of 54% of all voters want to see the federal government with a great deal of responsibility for disaster recovery. Considerably larger majorities say the same for state governments at 74%, and for local governments at 69%. Now, it is also important to point out here that those who don't want the federal government to have such a large role, they do still overwhelmingly want it to have a moderate amount of responsibility. So that's 36% of voters who take that view. Just 10% say they want the federal government to have only a little or no responsibility at all in this space. So I think one way to interpret this is that there's a meaningful group of folks who want to see state and local authorities taking the lead in responding, and who want to see the federal government playing more of a supporting role. So digging a little deeper here, we can also see that this is really quite a partisan story. This figure shows the percentage of Democrats, independents, and Republicans that want the different levels of government to have a great deal of responsibility for disaster recovery and rebuilding. So for Democrats, what we can see here is that there are majorities for all levels of government having a great deal of responsibility. And actually, there are just slightly lower expectations for local government than for federal and state. Republicans and independents look really similar here on the state and local level and quite different at the federal level. So overwhelmingly, about 70 to 75% of independents and Republicans share this expectation that state and local governments should play a major role. What we see that's different is that only a minority say that about the federal government. So just 37% of Republicans and 48%, just under half of independents. All right, so next we asked people in more detail what kinds of actions they think the federal government should take when there's a major disaster. And the bars in this figure show the percentage of respondents who indicated that yes, the federal government should take each type of action listed here. So the four actions we talked about or asked about were sending emergency supplies like food, water, and medicine, sending government staff or the military to help out in disaster zones, helping rebuild homes and infrastructure after a disaster, and giving families money to help them recover. So the first two of these are really focused on the kind of immediate need for assistance right after a disaster, and the other two kind of take on more longer term support and reflect kind of whether or not the government should be involved in recovery over a longer period. And so what we see here is that overwhelmingly, there's really near use of universal support and agreement that humanitarian assistance is something the federal government should be doing, including, both emergency supplies and civilian or military support in the immediate aftermath of a disaster where that's needed. And then we also see that there are large bipartisan majorities for longer term federal roles in helping to rebuild infrastructure and also providing financial support to help families recover. At the same time, on those issues, we do start to see some partisan gaps opening up. So overall, 8 in 10 voters want to see the federal government help with rebuilding infrastructure and homes. 68%, so more than 2 in 3, want to see it giving families money to help recover. But we see a 20 percentage point gap between Democrats and Republicans on rebuilding and infrastructure, and almost a 30 percentage point gap between them on giving families money to help recover, where there was very little daylight, if any, between them on the emergency assistance. Okay, so far we've looked at what people think government should be doing in response to disasters. But we also asked people how they think the government is doing in practice. And for these questions, we focused in particular on the federal government's response. So in this question, we asked people to rate the US government's responses to natural disasters and extreme weather events over the last 12 months. And about half of all voters, or 47%, rated its performance as poor or very poor. Those are the yellow sections of the bars here on this figure. Another 28% in gray rated its performance as fair, and just a little over 2 in 10 people, 22%, rated it as excellent or good. There were also a few groups that really stood out here for having a majority of that group say that the federal government's response has been poor or very poor over the last year. And those include Democrats at 55%. Also, interestingly, I think folks who did not vote in the 2024 election, those are registered voters who report that they didn't vote in November, that's at 57%. And then folks who had personal experiences of being affected by a disaster in the last year, 55% of them said that these responses by the federal government have been poor or very poor. Republicans here were the most favorable. 37% of them said the federal government has done a poor or very poor job, and 30% say its responses have been good or excellent. So I think it's noteworthy that even among the most favorable group, the government's performance is underwater. So another way we got at this idea was to ask people whether the US government is doing too much, not enough, or the right amount to help Americans affected by natural disasters. And so on this question, I think the responses come across as being even more critical of the government's performance. So almost 3 in 4 voters, 73%, said the federal government is not doing enough, and almost none, just 1%, said it's doing too much. Now, there were also majorities here who shared this view across partisan lines that the government's not doing enough. 59% of Republicans said it's not doing enough. And then we saw particularly large majorities of at least 8 in 10 Democrats, 8 in 10 of those non-voters from the 2024 election, and more than 8 in 10 people who were personally affected by disasters in the last year themselves, all saying that the federal government isn't doing enough to help with recovery. So another way of understanding the depth of this sentiment that the federal government isn't doing enough, I think, is to break out these responses by people's expectations of how much responsibility the government should have. So that's what we've done here in this figure. The bars here show the percentage of voters who said the government is not doing enough to help Americans affected by natural disasters by the level of responsibility that they told us that they think it should have in that question we looked at earlier. So we can see that 87% of people who think the federal government should have a great deal of responsibility say it's not doing enough. 66%, so 2 in 3, folks who say it should have a moderate amount of responsibility say it's not doing enough. And I think what's particularly striking here is that even among people who say the US government should have just a little bit of responsibility in disaster assistance, a majority of them, a bare majority, 51%, think that in practice, it's not doing enough in response to the disasters that people are actually experiencing. All right, so next we asked voters about their own recent experiences with natural disasters. And our first question was whether or not their household has been personally affected by a disaster or extreme weather event within the last year. So this is the question that Melanie asked you all at the top of the presentation. So the figure on the left here shows the percentage who answered yes, both overall and within different geographic settings. So across the entire sample, as we learned before, 17% reported being personally affected. But beyond this, I think what really stands out is that respondents who live in suburban environments were more likely to say they were affected than those in either rural or urban areas. And even more so, that residents of the South were more frequently affected. So, in general, residents of the South were more than twice as likely to be affected as those in other regions at 25% versus just 10 to 13% in other parts of the country. Now, the right-hand figure here shows the scale of the problems that natural disasters caused for the people who reported that they were personally affected. So we can see that just under half of folks, 47%, reported that they personally experienced a minor problem. And just over half reported a moderate or major problem. Moderate was 40% of those, and overall 12% reported a major problem. So this figure dives into the geographic variation I was just talking about in more detail. This map shows the percentage of respondents who were affected by disasters in 9 regions across the country. So it breaks those 4 out into 9, so we get some more detail. And again, we can see that the South really stands out at the high end. But even here, there are big differences. So more than 3 in 10 respondents, 31% of folks in the South Atlantic, Florida, Georgia, the Carolinas, Virginia, um, said that they were affected by a disaster. That's versus about 2 in 10 in the East, South, Central region, so Alabama, Mississippi, et cetera, and the West, South, Central region, Texas, Louisiana, Oklahoma. Um, so then at the other end of the spectrum, only 1 in 20 respondents, 5% in the Mountain West, reported being personally affected. New England came in second from the bottom. That was at 9%. Okay, so then in terms of the degree of impact, we looked at how this played out in a variety of different ways. And I think one thing that's not real surprising, but I think noteworthy to see is that when we look at people's assessment of how big of a problem they personally experienced from the disasters that they were affected by, income really comes into play in their experiences. So folks who have higher levels of income, either 100 to 150,000 or more than 150,000 annual income a year, they were on average about half as likely to say that they experienced a major problem than folks who had less less lower incomes. So 8% for folks in the 100 to 150 category, only 4% for those above 150 versus 13 to 15 for folks in the lower income levels. And I think that what, this really tells us is that obviously having more resources, being more likely to be insured can help people blunt the impact, recover more quickly when they do experience these events. I don't think that's surprising, but I think it's useful to see that in real data. Okay, so we also had an open-ended question that we asked people who did report that they were personally affected by a natural disaster in the last year. And we asked them to say how their family was affected. So we took all of the responses to that question and we tallied them up in terms of the different kinds of experiences that people reported having. And so there were 8 of these that came out commonly as themes in these responses. People talked about property damage. They talked about power outages. They talked about losing their income, not being able to get to their jobs, having their jobs go away, financial stress as a result of those experiences. They talked about not being able to get around, problems with transportation and mobility due to road closures. They talked about medical scares, people who were not able to get their medications, whose medications spoiled, who need to be having access to air conditioning and can't get too hot, and that being unavailable in heat waves and power outages. They talked about not having enough relief, not enough help to respond to the experiences that they were having. Talked about losing access to water, and finally being displaced from their homes or losing their homes completely. So what the responses here are, the percentages show out of the percent out of all people who gave us a response, a meaningful response to this question. Some folks just told us about the type of disaster that they had. We didn't include those in the denominator here. So of people who told us how they were affected, um, we can see that the largest percentages were for property damage and power outages. Those were most common. And then financial stress, road closures. I think, it's heartening, not surprising that some of the most extreme things that people tend to experience in these circumstances, home loss and displacement, were also among the least common. I think it is really instructive here, though, to take a look at the right-hand column. We've broken this out by people who reported that they had a minor problem or a moderate problem or a major problem. And the sample sizes are small once we get over to having a major problem in particular, very small. So I think it's important to say that this is suggestive, But nonetheless, we can really see with people who reported having a major problem that they were more likely to experience a variety of or multiple of these different impacts. All right, so next I want to share what people said about these experiences in some detail and some of the themes that came out. We got a lot of different responses that told us about the heartbreaking experiences people had with losing their homes, having medical problems, all of the kinds of things that we know occur in natural disasters. For the purposes of this presentation, because we've been talking about people's expectations of government, I thought it would be particularly interesting and useful to share some of the themes that came out in the responses where people volunteered their experiences with um, the government's role in their disaster response and recovery experience. And so there's three big themes I'm going to highlight. The first one is anger and disappointment. And there were kind of two big pieces to this that we saw. A number of people talked about the federal government, the president in particular, having made promises, broken them, and not experiencing enough support. And I will also say that a lot of these responses are from people who experienced Hurricane Helene. So one person who had reported that they personally had a minor problem in North Carolina during Hurricane Helene said FEMA pulled out too quickly. Trump broke his promise to send us federal funds to help. Another person in Texas said the Red Cross was overwhelmed and FEMA was nowhere to be found. Another person in North Carolina, again, experienced Florence and Helene, had a major problem themselves. Trump showed up lying, like always, saying he was going to help and then denied extra help. And this was not just one-sided. Somebody in Georgia pointed out that Biden promised help but sent none. Another thing that showed up here was a perception that when FEMA did show up, when the federal government was on site helping people, that it was playing politics and choosing who was going to help based on perceptions of their political orientation. So somebody in Georgia said there were incidences of FEMA representatives ignoring homes that had conservative or Trump political signs. And somebody in Florida who experienced hurricanes said that the Biden administration was horrible. A liberal representative skipped over houses and did not help those that had Trump signs in the yard. This is inexcusable, and people like this should be punished severely. So lots of anger, lots of mistrust, lots of feelings of betrayal. Another thing that really came out here when we look at what people were saying about the government was that their expectations for the role of the government go beyond just providing relief, being present in the immediate aftermath for assistance. And they really go into ways that the government can help promote resilience, and maybe even prevent some of these worst impacts of these disasters, and also ways that they can help make sure that recovery goes more smoothly for people. So on that resilience piece, we had someone in Florida who pointed out that there was storm surge and their personal house was built far above that level. Codes need to be enforced to keep housing above historic flood levels. Somebody in New Jersey pointed out that the local infrastructure is a mess and that we should be focusing on our electrical grid. Couple people who wanted to see more regulation to help with recovery. Somebody in Tennessee pointed out that the government hasn't done anything to stop environmentally damaging impacts of companies involved in the rebuilding effort, and that has increased risks to communities from the poor practices of those who are doing rebuilding work. Somebody in Florida said that the insurance industry should be required to provide service and have their premiums capped. When people have insurance, they expect it to be there to help them when they need it. All right, and then finally, one last theme that I think was really interesting to see in a few places here was actually about not necessarily the absence of the government, but about people's ability to be self-reliant, for neighbors to help neighbors in these circumstances, and the perception kind of that we talked about a little bit earlier, that government, a big role for government isn't necessarily always needed. So somebody in Michigan said that they experienced ice-mageddon with no power for weeks, but they helped and all is good, and they didn't need dollars from the government. One person who experienced personally a moderate problem in Georgia wrote kind of a novel about the way that her community came together and helped each other in a variety of ways to get things back up and running. But what really stood out here was her conclusion that people did what self-sufficient old school Americans have always done. They didn't wait on government, and I'm extremely proud of how our community rallied around one another. In Vermont, we had someone who mentioned that they were personally trapped in their home with a medically vulnerable individual, and they had a wonderful neighbor who helped them. And it was not the state or town who helped us, it was the nice man who lives next door. So I think there's a lot that we could take from this data, but there's three key takeaways I want to highlight briefly. The first one is I think it's really important to note that Americans expect state and local governments to play a lead role in disaster response. And that's especially true in more conservative areas. So, for officials who are in those places, um, it's clear that they need effective strategies that are informed by local needs. And I think this really ties in nicely to some of what Ben's going to be talking about ways that local officials can perhaps use survey research to get that kind of data to help them in those efforts. At the same time, we also saw most people really do want the federal government to offer both immediate and longer term assistance. 3 and 4 overall say it's not doing enough. And that's coming at a time when we see that the federal government is cutting funding to FEMA, NOAA, and that those kinds of cuts are really at odds with these expectations for the government to be doing more and not less. Finally, that 17% of people who report being affected by a disaster or extreme weather in the last year is really a lot. And we did see this wide variation in severity and geography. I think those final themes that we just heard about in people's own words, anger and disappointment with government, but also pride in local self-reliance, those are common experiences. And with that, I'll turn it over to Ben.
Thank you so much, Andrea. Hello to everybody. My name is Ben Greenfield. I am a lead analyst. I do work with both Embold Research and Change Research. And today I am going to shift us just slightly from the more broad to the more specific and talk about some of the work we've done in Los Angeles County in the aftermath of the January 2025 fires. So just for some background or to refresh your memory, in January of this year, the Eaton and Palisades fires, among other fires that were not quite as big, burned in Los Angeles County. So the Eaton fire, you can see, was on the east side of Los Angeles County, primarily in Altadena. And then the Palisades fire was on the west side by the coast, primarily in Pacific Palisades and Malibu. And together, these fires covered nearly 40,000 acres. They destroyed nearly 20,000 homes, businesses, and other structures. And they caused around 200,000 people to be evacuated from their homes, many of whom, as we'll see, continue not to be in their homes. So, in the immediate aftermath of the fires, a group was founded called the Department of Angels. And Department of Angels was founded through a collaboration between the California Community Foundation, SNAP, Evan Spiegel, and Bobby Murphy. And the goal of this organization was to do work that ensured that community members were the ones stewarding their own recovery. And this is in part a response to some other disasters in which outside groups have come in and kind of dictated some of the terms of the rebuilding and recovery. And there was a deep belief that drives Department of Angels work, that these communities should be driving their own recovery. They have done a lot of work in a number of different areas, working with local groups and local and state officials. Just a few of the initiatives they've launched include directly supporting more than a dozen community-based organizations in Altadena, Pasadena, Pacific Palisades, and Malibu. They've provided advocacy, organizing, and communications assistance, which has drawn response from lawmakers at the local and state level, as well as considerable coverage at the local and national level. They have also provided access to shared digital spaces and convened in-person gatherings, which have helped to facilitate collaboration on long-term recovery. And that is just a small taste of some of the work that they've done. So what we have had the opportunity to do is to conduct 2 surveys to date of the impacted communities in partnership with the Department of Angels. So Embold has done these 2 polls of fire impacted areas, which were an attempt to help understand the experiences of affected residents and to determine some of the areas of greatest needs. So first, we conducted a poll in February of just over 1,500 adults in Altadena, Pasadena, Pacific Palisades, and Malibu, as well as over 1,000 adults from other areas of LA County, just to both to serve as a point of comparison, but also because people throughout LA County were impacted in different ways by the fires and in different ways will be involved with the recovery and rebuilding. In June, we conducted a second survey. This one was of nearly 2,000 adults, specifically in the most heavily impacted areas. So Altadena, Pasadena, Pacific Palisades, Malibu, and we also included Sierra Madre in this one. Now, you might think that it would be a challenge to conduct public opinion research in areas where people have, in many cases, been displaced from their homes, in many cases are facing day-to-day challenges that are quite considerable in the recovery process. If you thought that would be difficult, you are correct. We have used 2 primary methods to try to reach impacted individuals. One is to directly contact those who are registered to vote or were registered to vote in impacted areas. The vast majority of those who were living in impacted areas at the time of the fires continue to be registered to vote in those areas. They haven't re-registered, even if they have relocated. And so we are able to directly contact them based on their voter file information. We're also able to place online ads targeting those who were in the impacted areas around the time of the fires. So using these 2 methods, we have actually had a really considerable amount of success reaching people in these areas. In some cases, we have actually gotten several percent of those who are living in impacted communities to respond to the surveys. So the response rate using the methods we've used has been quite successful, which has allowed us to get these large sample sizes and really help to get good data points on what these communities need. So what have we found? First off, on the question of displacement, what we found is that as of June, so the June numbers are in yellow here, over 8 in 10 residents of Altadena and about 9 in 10 residents of Pacific Palisades were still displaced from their homes in June. Both of these numbers were down from February, but only slightly. So you can see the February numbers in dark blue here. And basically what you're seeing there is that a few people have been able to return to the homes that they were in before the fires, but the vast majority of people in Altadena and Pacific Palisades still are not able to live in their homes, either because they burned completely or were severely damaged to the point where they need substantial repairs. In Malibu, which is just next to Pacific Palisades, we do see that half of those from Malibu are not able to live in their home at the moment, but half are. Pasadena, which is just south of Altadena, was not as directly and not as universally impacted by the fires as Altadena was, but we still have a considerable percentage of those who live in Pasadena who are not able to live in their homes, 16% as of June. So this is clearly still a major problem that does not simply touch the main 2 impacted communities of Altadena and Pacific Palisades. And we dug in a bit deeper on what people's housing experiences have looked like in the months since the fires. We attempted to address two different things with this question. So number one, whether people are living in unstable or stable situations, that is, whether they will need to move again in the coming months. And number two, whether they've stayed in one place since the fires or if they have stayed in multiple places. And what we found is that 4 in 10 residents of Pacific Palisades and just over a third of those from Altadena are still in unstable lodging situations and expect that they will have to move again within the coming months. Furthermore, the majority of those two communities in particular have stayed in multiple places since the fires. Now, one thing that we have learned elsewhere in the research that we've done in February and June is that each time that people have to move, and this might be intuitive, but each time that people have to move, there is not only a substantial financial cost, but there are also other costs. Each move takes a substantial toll on people's mental health. It also introduces logistical challenges. If you're having to move to, say a different city or a different neighborhood, it might be more difficult for you to get to work. It might be more difficult for you to get your kids to school. So every one of these people who either will have to move again soon, or in many cases have had to move several times since the fires, this takes a substantial and cumulative toll on these people, and there is a substantial need, in terms of helping to provide stability over the coming months and years. So we asked directly about some of the major issues that displaced people are facing, and this question was asked only of those who are not currently in their homes. What we found is that most displaced people are dealing with major financial challenges. So you can see on this top line here that 58% of our June respondents who were displaced said that they were managing major financial challenges. We didn't ask about that one exactly in February. But we also see that significant numbers continue to face other major issues as well, such as with navigating systems like insurance and FEMA, paying for housing, their temporary housing, deciding whether or not to stay in their community, mental health support, finding housing, etc. So there are many issues, and keeping in mind that many of our respondents are experiencing more than one of these, it helps to paint a picture of, for every single one of these thousands of displaced people across these communities, there are many different challenges that people are facing, and every one of them is a need that that Department of Angels can help to rectify and to manage. In order to dig into people's most pressing needs a little bit more deeply, we asked an open-ended question about what people's most pressing needs were and how local community groups and government agencies could best support them and their communities. One thing that the responses to this question drove home is that, like on the previous slide, financial needs are the key concern. Financial needs were brought up in these responses more than any non-financial needs. However, we did really get some additional color here when we look at the specific types of financial needs that people brought up. So many people talked about different housing related costs. So, having to move to a place with higher rent. People talked about price gouging, which we know has been a major problem across LA County in terms of landlords driving up the prices with the many people who are displaced. Also, people talked about the costs of rebuilding. A variety of obstacles to rebuilding came up frequently in these responses. So not only the costs, but also delays and bureaucracy that people faced. And we'll talk more about rebuilding in a few slides. Other common issues that we saw here included concerns about the loss of community, environmental concerns, people worried about contamination of their property, many different issues that people brought up with respect to insurance, and we'll talk about that in more detail in a moment, as well as mental health needs. So on the question of insurance, first I wanted to draw attention to this one question we asked, which was specifically about insurance coverage for people's temporary housing. So, when people have homeowners insurance, often or maybe always, those insurance coverage includes clauses for how much coverage people receive when they are displaced from their home to pay for their temporary housing. And what we saw in this question is that As of a year from now, 7 in 10 of those who are currently displaced say that they will have no remaining coverage to cover their temporary housing. So you can see these numbers on this all displaced line here. And what I want to draw your attention to is these shades of blue here. So these are, in the shades of blue are those who have more than 1 year of remaining coverage. So that is just under 30% of those who are displaced. Everybody else, the other 70% of those who are displaced, either are not sure, 12%, or in the red say that they have fewer than 12 months of remaining coverage. In some cases, they have none remaining. They already ran out. Or 21% actually said that they never had any of this coverage to begin with. So what this slide really shows, in some ways, this is a ticking time bomb. There are the vast majority of those who are displaced from their homes have no real shot at returning to their homes in the next 12 months. It's going to take longer than that for people to rebuild. And so, at the time that people's coverage runs out, they will be in a dire situation where either they have to begin paying for temporary housing out of pocket, in addition to, the costs that they might have on the property that they own, or they might have to make some kind of alternate arrangement. So this is an area of substantial need that Department of Angels is working on some solutions to try to address. We asked more broadly about insurance experiences in an open-ended question, and what we found is that most respondents described deeply negative experiences, ranging from challenging to horrifying. People talked about insurers derailing their recovery, denying their claims, delays, underpayments, poor communication, overly complicated claims processes, etc. That said, there was really a substantial divide between different insurers. So we saw overwhelmingly negative experiences with the California Fair Plan and with State Farm in particular, but very positive experiences with USAA and AAA. And so, there are some important learnings there in terms of how this can be addressed with individuals who are experiencing some of these problems. On the question of rebuilding versus selling, so we asked this question of those who either had their home or business burned down or sustained major damage. And we saw that the vast majority of those who lost their home or businesses want to rebuild. So nearly 9 in 10 in Altadena, over 8 in 10 in Pacific Palisades, and 8 in 10 in Malibu would like to rebuild. However, the plurality, or even a slim majority in Pacific Palisades, say that they will only rebuild, repair, or remediate if they can figure out financing or a pathway to make it affordable. And this is depicted in a little bit more detail on this next slide, where we asked people about the major factors in their decisions about whether to rebuild. And what you can see here is that the top factor overall, by far, is the out-of-pocket cost to rebuild. So for those who lost their home, 2/3 say that the out-of-pocket cost to rebuild is a major factor in their decisions about whether to rebuild. That said, there are other major factors as well that are experienced by significant numbers of people, including concerns about environmental safety, delays or barriers in permitting and approval, timing and amounts of insurance payouts, and so on. And so there are many different things that people are juggling when they're making these decisions about whether they can and whether they should rebuild. And each one of these represents a problem that in some cases could be at least managed, if not solved completely. And so Department of Angels has taken some of these learnings and tried to put them into practice, as I'll detail in a moment. So a few key takeaways and ways that Department of Angels is responding to some of these. So again, more than 7 in 10 residents of impacted communities are still not in their homes. Over 6 in 10 displaced residents have had to move repeatedly. In response to this, one of the things that Department of Angels is doing is working to unlock federal funds and other funding sources. They are also working with state and local groups as well as political leaders to ensure that these funds are distributed effectively. I mentioned multiple insurance issues, including the fact that most displaced residents will run out of displacement insurance coverage in 12 months or less, as well as the fact that insurance is generally an ongoing source of frustration. And Department of Angels has taken multiple steps to try to solve some of these insurance-related problems, including supporting different efforts to make insurance policy holders whole, but also taking a long-term approach. They've convened what they call a Finance and Insurance Solutions Working Group to recommend reforms that will make fire insurance more sustainable, fair, and accessible, since this is a problem that not only needs to be solved for victims of the January fires, but will need to be solved for future disasters as well. And finally, most people who lost their homes would like to rebuild, but face significant financial and logistical hurdles. And so Department of Angels is working to accelerate various housing and rebuilding solutions. And just a couple of those include some that make rebuilding faster and more affordable, like alternative construction methods and streamlined permitting. So that, obviously there are major hurdles that, the impacted residents of some of these communities will be facing that will last years into the future. But Department of Angels is one of the main groups that are doing great work on the ground, and working with other local groups to try to solve these problems as best as that they possibly can be solved. And that is the end of our presentation.
Thanks so much, Ben, and thank you, Andrea. We have a couple questions in Q&A, and please, if you have any questions, send them on through. We'll ask them live. The first question is for Ben. The displacement after the LA fires is very important and not something I thought about. Do you also think about how many people will be without any insurance at that point? I believe California forbids policies being canceled for a year after a major event, but that's another ticking time bomb that will really affect long-term recovery. No insurance, no bank loan, no rebuilding.
Yes, and I don't have the exact numbers in front of me, but we asked about this, and this is something that many people are going through, actually, whether or not they lost their homes, but particularly for those who are trying to think about whether to rebuild or not. One of the major concerns that people face is the fear that they won't be able to be insured in the future. As a resident of California, I can't speak. All three of us are residents of California, but I have had significant trouble as someone who lives in an area that has not been affected by wildfires directly, just getting insurance coverage, and this is going to be a growing issue, but even more so in some of these areas that already have been impacted by the fires. And so it is an ongoing concern, and it's one that people are dealing with, kind of in this mountain of issues that they're having to face in the aftermath of the fire and the recovery.
Yeah, no, as a resident of California and near some of the fires that happened a couple of years ago, it's definitely something we've been thinking about. It makes me think about this combination of the national data in this case study. What do we think this means for projects and communities, local government, local orgs, as extreme weather becomes more prominent?
Do you want to take
Either
that
of you.
one?
I mean, I think it's instructive to take the expectation that people have that local governments take the lead here, right? With the wealth of specific data that we can get via surveys like the one that Ben led here with Department of Angels in LA, that are very focused on local needs, local context, what people are experiencing that is not the same from place to place because it depends greatly on the kind of disaster they've experienced, on all kinds of things about how these events play out in different ways in different places. And so, I mean, to me, it really just suggests that the kind of data that our team collected here and worked with Department of Angels to facilitate is something that, unfortunately is going to be needed more and more, and also can be really valuable and helpful for local officials who are thinking about how they can meet those expectations that people are saying for them to take a lead, and what people in their own communities need and want most when these events happen.
Yes, something that we saw with the Department of Angels polling in LA County is that people have relied on many different types of organizations on the ground. Many people talked about, going to their local church, for certain types of needs, going to other local groups. And, many local orgs have sprouted up in the aftermath of the fires to help people on the ground, and, community organizations have been built. That said, people also have relied very heavily on the Red Cross. They have relied heavily on FEMA. And I think that, it remains to be seen what exactly FEMA will look like the next time that there's a major wildfire in California. I think we have seen a different type of response from FEMA in Texas, but FEMA is a very key piece of the puzzle that has been there in previous natural disasters. And without them, I think that the recovery would look quite a bit different. And that's something that we are going to have to contend with the way that FEMA is being run now compared to how it has been in the past.
Yeah, I think that's great. I've launched our exit poll if you would mind filling that out, just so we can make sure we get all the information you need. Looking at my list, I think that's all the questions we had. We will be following up with both the slide deck and this recording today after this presentation. I want to thank Andrea and Ben so much for presenting this work here today. Really interesting, especially given the environment and the context that we're living in. With that, I'm going to go ahead and close it on out. Thank you all so much for attending. Have a wonderful Friday, and I hope you have a great weekend. Bye, everyone.